You know, when a new illness pops up, it can feel like this big, scary mystery. But for a special group of people, we're talking disease detectives, it's really a puzzle. And they have a very specific set of tools to trace an outbreak all the way back to its source and, stop it dead in its tracks. So today, we're going to look at two of their most powerful tools and see just how they crack the code of contagion.
It really all comes down to this one question, right? How do you actually do it? And to answer that, investigators need some very specific data to understand not just what's happening, but how it's happening. Okay, so picture this, a big community picnic. Everyone's having a good time, sharing food. Well, that single gathering, that shared experience, can become ground zero. It's what epidemiologists call a common source exposure. A few days go by, and then the calls start trickling in. People who were at that picnic, they're all coming down with the same symptoms. And that's the very first signal that an outbreak is officially underway. And this, right here, is where the real detective work kicks in. Because knowing people are sick is one thing, but to stop the outbreak, you have to know, did it all come from one bad dish of potato salad, or is it now spreading from person to person? Because those are two totally different problems that need two totally different solutions.
So, to solve that puzzle, investigators use two key measurements that, honestly, tell two completely different stories. Think of these rates as the essential tools that let them see the whole picture and figure out exactly what to do next.
This really lays it all out, doesn't it? On one side, you've got the primary attack rate, or PAR. That's all about the initial event. It asks the question, how powerful, how infectious was that original source? Then, on the other side, you have the secondary attack rate, or SAR. And that one looks at what happens next. It asks, once someone gets sick, how easily do they pass it on to the people around them?
All right, let's dive into that first tool. We're going to focus just on that very first moment of infection, the one that started this whole thing.
So the primary attack rate, or PAR, it's really just the percentage of people who got sick after being exposed to that one common source. And the math is as simple as it sounds. You just take the number of new cases and you divide it by the total number of people who were there and exposed. That's it.
To put it another way, the PAR answers a really direct question. If 100 people ate the potato salad at our picnic, the PAR just tells us what percentage of those 100 people ended up getting sick. It completely isolates the impact of that one source.
So, what happens if you run the numbers and you get a PAR of, say, 80%? Whoa, that is a massive red flag. A number that high tells investigators that the source, in our case, the potato salad, was probably super contaminated, or that the bug itself was just incredibly good at making people sick.
But of course, the story doesn't stop at the picnic. Once people go home, a whole second chapter of the outbreak can begin. And this is where we have to start charting that person-to-person spread. And for that, you need a totally different tool.
And that brings us to the secondary attack rate, or SAR. The definition here is super important. It's the proportion of susceptible contacts, people who could get sick, who do get sick after being around someone who was infected at the original source. See, we're not looking at the picnic anymore, we're looking inside people's houses.
So let's say someone from the picnic goes home sick, and a few days later their spouse catches it too. Bam, that's a secondary case. The SAR basically measures how often that happens. It's really the best way to figure out just how contagious the disease itself is between people who are in close contact.
And, as you might guess, not all contact is created equal. The SAR is almost always going to be highest inside a home, where you have that really close, prolonged contact. It's going to be way lower in a workplace or some other casual setting. When it comes to SAR, context is absolutely everything.
Okay, so we've got these two different numbers, PAR and SAR, but why is it so critical to keep them separate? Well, it's definitely not just for academic points. Each number points public health officials to a completely different, specific action plan.
Think of it like a playbook. If you find a high primary attack rate, your mission is source control. Period. You find that contaminated food and get it off the shelves. You shut down the bad water supply, you attack the source. But if you find a high secondary attack rate, the mission changes completely. Now it's about contact control. You focus on isolating sick people and quarantining their close contacts to break those chains of transmission.
This quote from the research really just nails it. By separating PAR and SAR, officials can be really surgical with their response. They can use the right tool for the right phase of the outbreak, use their resources way more efficiently, and, at the end of the day, do a much better job of protecting the people who are most at risk.
And you better believe the consequences of getting this wrong are massive. If you just lump everything together into one general number, you could end up quarantining thousands of people for a foodborne illness that doesn't even spread between them. Or you might waste a ton of money deep cleaning a building when the real problem is a super contagious virus that's just spreading from house to house. It's a recipe for wasted time, wasted money, and losing the public's trust.
So, what's the big takeaway here? It's actually pretty simple, but it's also incredibly profound. In an outbreak, getting clear, precise, and correctly separated data isn't just a nice-to-have. It's the absolute foundation of an effective response that protects communities and, literally, saves lives.
Now, all this sounds pretty straightforward, right? Well, in the real world, it gets a lot messier. Investigators run into some major hurdles. For one, there's often no standard definition for these rates, which makes it tough to compare outbreaks. You've got people who are sick but have no symptoms, and they often get missed, which can totally throw off the numbers. And then there are all these social factors, how families live and interact, that play a huge role but are incredibly hard to measure.
And all of this leaves us with a really critical question for the future. We know how important this data is. We also know how challenging it is to get it right. So in a world where new threats are always just around the corner, you have to wonder, are our tools and our methods really sharp enough to keep us safe when the next big one arrives?